when we think about sexual reproduction, we all have different images in our mind, don't we? And that's a really interesting concept to think about because it's a lot deeper subject than is really on the surface. One thing, there's a little caveat with my presentation tonight, is that this presentation is suitable for all audiences, just to let you know, okay? So you don't have to worry. So, but before we get into the subject, I got to ask a question. We're going to be talking about a subject that's very broad and expansive, and we have to apply some critical thinking. So I got to ask you a question. Do horses fly? Anybody remember this symbol? This is, I think, Pegasus, isn't it? Okay. Well, do horses fly? Some horses fly, right? At least this one does. Oh, it's not a horse. Okay. So I'm going to ask you a question. Is that statement true? Let's raise our hands. How many think it's absolutely true that horses fly? Oh, wait a second. There's nobody out there. Would you say it's likely or probable? Anybody? Improbable? Improbable. How about impossible? Most people say impossible, right? Now, why do you say that? Why do you say that horses don't fly and it's impossible? Well, you're applying some critical thinking, aren't you? And that's exactly what we want to do tonight. And I'd like you to remember that as we go through this presentation, because we're going to be talking about applying critical thinking and logic to science and reality when it comes to reproduction, specifically sexual reproduction, and how it fits into our world, into our worldview, into evolution theory or faith-based theory or worldview, okay? So no matter what the facts are and what critical thinking you apply, sometimes you will call the impossible probable or even possible, depending on what you need or what you want in the end game, or what you hope is true, or perhaps your agenda. Isn't that true? That's the way it's done in our world. Politically, we see that, and scientifically, and in all aspects of our life. So, we're going to be talking about reproduction tonight. A little introduction and caveat. Reproduction in living systems are very complicated. And some organizations even exhibit multiple types and variations on the main themes. There are thousands and thousands of organisms that have varying types of reproductive cycles and processes. So it's a very broad subject. Okay, so tonight, make sure we understand we're going to be kind of looking at a top view. Okay, does that make sense? So the four main types that I thought, just to review, is we have a couple different types. One is what's called asexual, and that's basically where just a cell divides and you get a clone. And again, this is kind of from a simplistic point of view, but that's what we need to do. Another one, what I call parasexual, where there's crossover and gene exchanges, for example, in bacteria, which are they sexual? Are they asexual? Well, it's kind of hard to describe it. In plants, you have other kinds of reproduction like vegetative and budding and spores. And then you have standard sexual reproduction where you have male and female commingling of genetic materials. Does that make sense? There are many different kinds. And depending on the species and the organism itself within a species, there can be a mix of these. Some organisms do both sexual and asexual, depending on the environment. So it's a very interesting subject. But the focus of what we're going to be talking about is sexual reproduction. I chose that because it probably, it's exhibited in most multicellular animals that we know about. Remember, we're talking about understanding what reality is. And one of the interesting things about sexual reproduction, it expresses the most diversity and variety in terms of genetic diversity that we experience and see. All of you are examples of that out there. You all have a lot of variations in you, and it's because of sexual reproduction. And for the purpose of our talk, it has the most direct and clear effect on the validity of the evolutionary theory, and that's what we're going to dive into. Okay, with me so far? Okay. Sexual reproduction, how does it fit into the evolutionary picture? Well, I like equations, okay? So I'm going to put this in an equation form for us in a couple slides. So, evolution started from nothing, right? That's what they say. And then during that Big Bang process and following, time came about, atoms, space, energy. Okay? And by the way, in each one of these, obviously we've heard different presentations on all of these different phases and the parts of these equations as part of our apologetic structure. Does that make sense? We all heard of those things. Okay? So now we have, space and atoms. With more time, the atoms go through chemical changes, chance chemical changes and interactions. And combined with energy, they form, guess what? New life, right? The last presentation I gave was about the origin of life from this particular equation. So, now we've got this new life formed with more time and more energy. Now we add in chance mutational changes. Now we're talking about the evolutionary concept, how it works. And then you add something that's interesting that we've never really talked about that much. Added to this equation is a key component, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight, is the sexual reproductive engine to drive or pass on those mutational changes to the next generation. That is part of the process of the evolutionary concept. And combined with the concept we've talked about in natural selection, where these gene changes that have been passed on by reproduction then are saved or enhanced or captured through the generations by selective natural selection. And as a result, you get new species. So these equations in a capsule are what evolution's all about. But we're going to focus on that engine that's up there. So why is sexual reproduction so critical to the evolutionary theory? Well, there's a man named Thomas Huxley who was considered Darwin's bulldog, if you will. He said a very interesting statement. He said, "The great tragedy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact." You remember back, we were talking about critical thinking, looking at science and reality, and coming to a conclusion, right? So we're looking at the facts. What is this, he's talking about this ugly fact. Darwin himself made an interesting statement. He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ or process like sexual evolution, that's my ad, existed which could not have been possibly formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would what? Absolutely break down. Because of this interesting situation, this comment, and the truth of it, today, evolutionists term sexual reproduction the queen of evolutionary problems. That's their term for it, which is interesting. Well, why? What's the ugly fact that we're talking about? That's what we're going to be talking about tonight. What are some of those ugly facts? What's the science and the reality that we apply critical thinking to? Here it is. This is the whole presentation in one slide tonight. The sexual reproductive engine or process for passing on genetic information, remember that's its purpose, from one generation to the next, and any associated genetic changes leading to new species has to be what? Fully functional during the first generation change. Remember Darwin? He said successive changes over a long period of time. But this particular factor in those evolution equations has to be fully functional in the first generation in order for the whole process of evolution to lead to new life, new species. You see what it's saying there? So, otherwise, if it's not fully functional, there's going to be no second or third or fourth generations. That means no new species, no evolution happening. It's the end, no beginning. A beautiful hypothesis is slayed, like Huxley said. Sexual reproduction is a one-generational issue. And that, my friends, is the key statement of and concept in our presentation tonight. It's a really interesting concept that destroys the evolutionary equation that we talked to in those previous slides. What's generational mean? So for generational, for our purposes, for our talk, I'm going to call it, it's an organism's lifespan, whatever organism you're talking about. Some reproduce only once during their lifespan, others reproduce multiple times, and when reproductive maturity is reached, varies widely depending on the organism, doesn't it? So I went to the internet and said, well, what does a generation mean for particular animals? I wanted to know what the longest living animal there is. And just guess which one it is in this list. Well, I organized it. Japanese koi fish. Can you believe that? 225 years, more or less. Okay? A tortoise, we always know it's around 150 years, more or less. A chimp, 50 years. Salmon, my favorite animal in the world, right, Chris? 2 to 7 years, depending on it. Pink salmon, every 2 years, on odd years. Dragonfly, 4 months. That's its lifespan. Reproductive lifespan. A housefly, 4 weeks. A midge, which is a little tiny small insect, 5 days. Well, that isn't nothing. Watch this. The mayfly, 5 minutes. It comes out as a nymph form, as an adult, flies around and mates, lays its eggs, and dies. It doesn't even have time to eat. Isn't that amazing? So, evolution, microbes to man as a theory, like Darwin stated, absolutely breaks down. No matter how old the earth is, a fully functional reproductive engine must be operating from the start during that first generation of that particular organism. For the mayfly, guess how long you get for evolution to work? 5 minutes. It's got to be done. You have to have a fully functional reproductive system in the mayfly, and you got 5 minutes to get her done. You don't have billions of years. The koi is a lot better off. They get a whole 225 years. That still is not a whole lot of time in the evolutionary time frame, is it? Sexual reproduction is a one-generational issue. We're going to be saying that a lot tonight. So here's the equation that we had, kind of a capsulized version of it. What happens to the evolutionary process if you take out the engine? It's not functional during that first generation of that first life. Well, guess what? You get no new species happening. It's the end. And here's an interesting thought. As a result, that time clock in the evolutionary equation, it's meaningless. Long ages are no longer a factor. Theoretically, evolution or the world could be around for billions, 100 billion years. And it really doesn't matter because the reproductive engine is the critical step in this thing. Does that make sense? I like to think simple in this. So what implication does it have when you take a factor out of an equation? It has a serious impact on the result, like you don't get a result. Evolution says if you have enough time, right, even the most irreducibly complex organism or process could possibly have formed by numerous successive slight modifications. That's the mantra, right? Sexual reproduction says if you're a mayfly, you have 5 minutes to get it right. There's a problem here. Time is no longer an issue. That's one of the interesting things that really surprised me when I got to thinking about it. Tying these two things together, one generational reproductive process, time in the equation has no longer a factor. So here's the theme of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to repeat this many times, so when you walk out of here, you're going to walk out with two things, okay? The takeaway, as Huxley said, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis, evolution, and actually it is kind of beautiful. It's amazing how it's so tied together and intricate by an ugly fact. That slaying happens. And the ugly fact is what? Sexual reproduction is a one-generational issue. Do you hear a theme in our talk so far? So the types of reproduction. Generally speaking, you have two basic types, asexual and sexual. Asexual reproduction just simply is typical with single-cell life forms. Some examples are bacteria and algae and amoebas and such like that. It's also in other organisms too, but this is just a general top-level comment. Sexual reproduction is typical with the vast majority of multicellular animals, more of what we know, species and significant types of plant species like the flowering seed producers. I like guppies. I just bought guppies for my kids, and I've watched the females give birth to little tiny babies. I have 10 of them in my tank right now. Little tiny itsy-bitsy guys, all produced by sexual reproduction. And their lifespan is, well, in my tank it was like 1 week. So they live for maybe a couple of years at the absolute most. Snakes, chimps, and one of my favorite flowers, marigolds, all reproduce sexually. There are a number of other reproductive processes, especially in the plant world, and there's certainly a number of parasexual gene transfers that happen, and a few really unique mechanisms in the animal and plant world and in the protist world with many species. I mean, it's very complex. We're not going to talk about that tonight. So what is asexual reproduction? Well, basically, it's duplicating the genetic material, the chromosomes, of a parent cell of a particular plant or animal, and then the cell divides into two identical, fully functional daughter cells by a process called mitosis. There's going to be a test at the end of this. You have to know these two terms. Mitosis is one of them. Not really. Forget about that. Just remember that asexual is basically cloning. Actually, in our bodies, for example, our skin cells, they all reproduce asexually, where one cell divides into two new skin cells, okay? God forbid if that didn't happen that way. Who knows what we would look like? I'm really glad God uses asexual reproduction mostly in our body, except for our sex cells. And I think there's a couple others too that are kind of have a variation of that. I'm really thankful. So what is sexual reproduction? Now it gets a little bit more complicated. Cloning is pretty simple in concept to understand. So the genetic material in sexual reproduction, the chromosomes from male and female reproductive cells of the parents, are reduced by 1/2 by a process called meiosis. Remember the other was mitosis. This is meiosis. Now that's something you can really easily remember, right? You got that down? So we have a a parent cell, the sex cell in the organism, reducing the number of chromosomes from its original normal number by 1/2. It's always 1/2. During fertilization, then, the male and female reproductive cells that have half of the chromosomes commingle to form a new immature daughter cell containing genetic traits from both parents. That's a big difference from cloning. After gestation period, the immature daughter cell matures to a new fully functional organism exhibiting a combination of genetic traits between the original parents, similar to from the original parents. And they end up with a specific male or female designation or distinction as a result. That's part of it. Whereas with cloning, what you start with is what you get. Does that make sense? So there's a real big difference. And I hope that's semi-clear. An example, we're an organism that experiences sexual reproduction. We start out in the human sex cell with 46 chromosomes. And during the meiosis process, the male sperm cell and the female egg cell are reduced in number of chromosomes by exactly 50%, 1/2. The sperm has half, the female has half, egg. Then, during fertilization, they commingle back together, cells from both sexes, and form an embryo that has the original human genome in it, fully complement. Does that make sense? So that's an example of, because we're mostly familiar with that. Okay. And then you have gestation and birth, and guess what? You get that little baby there, right? I have a brand new grandson. He's 3 months old. That's what happened to him. And he exhibits traits from both his mom and his dad, and even traits from me. Okay? Lord help the man. Okay? But that's exactly what happens. If he was a clone, he'd be just like me. Wouldn't that be terrible? Okay, so think about this. Now we're going to start thinking about this, about the origin of sexual reproduction. Generally, evolution teaches that life first reproduced asexually. The simple process, and I'm just going to say simple. It's really not simple. And then it evolved into sexual reproduction. In other words, mitosis to meiosis, asexual to sexual. In this presentation, we're going to assume, for the sake of argument, that asexual reproduction was there, but it has its own similar ugly facts, okay? But we shall focus on the origins of sexual reproduction. Let's look at some of the ugly facts. That's our purpose. Let's apply some critical thinking to what the facts are about sexual reproduction and how it's a one-generational problem for evolution. Backing up and talking about critical thinking, especially when it comes to, for example, when you're talking to another person about this subject or other similar subjects. Let's focus on reproduction. When you're talking about the evolution of sexual reproduction, many try to justify its presence or how it came about by why or its benefits or the fact that it exists. But that really that's not real critical thinking. That's hopeful thinking, in my opinion. The real question is, and what should be the justification for either concepts, either worldview, is how it came about. Thinking about the facts and that. Not why, but how. So don't let anyone talk to you, get you off track by just discussing why it's valuable, because it is valuable. But the real question is how it came about, and that's what we're going to look into. So one of the first ugly facts, in my opinion. Now we're going to get into some of the ugly facts, okay? And ask some critical questions about them. For any trait, talking about sexual reproduction, there's a DNA code for that, right? Everything is a result of a DNA code. For any trait to be expressed, to actually happen, there must have evolved a set of DNA coding for that trait. That's the facts. Where did the DNA code come from when it comes to sexual reproduction? Because it itself has to be coded in the cell before it can happen. How did natural selection select for reproduction, sexual reproduction, when sexual reproduction is first required for natural selection to operate? Does that make sense? It's circular reasoning. Thinking about that doesn't make sense, does it? No code, no sexual reproduction, no evolution. Now we're going to get a little bit complicated, and you probably won't remember any of this slide coming up, but I just want to tell you that it kind of conveys the idea and gives the facts that we can ask some questions about. Is that clear as mud? Okay. This is a chart that describes or shows the basic flow chart of the two different types of reproduction. Asexual on the left, sexual on the right. It's the other way around for me. So, okay? And I'm just going to go through this, and then you can forget about it, okay? Because you'll never remember it. On the left-hand side, the asexual mitosis is very straightforward. In the center, you have a parent cell. The chromosomes duplicate. They line up in the middle of the cell. The cell divides, and you end up getting two exact copies of the parent. No changes. Now, changes do happen. There are errors that are made, but I'm talking about its basic process. Does that make sense? Very simple. Duplicate them, divide them, you get two new cells that are fully functional. Over on the right-hand side, sexual reproduction is very complicated. Okay, so the first thing that happens is you duplicate the chromosomes again. Instead of 46, you have, 92 for the human, right? Am I right? To start with. You duplicate all the DNA, the chromosomes. It's interesting, the first stages of sexual reproduction, instead of, having pairs of chromosomes that kind of line up, so when they split apart you have equal numbers, they form what's called a tetrad in that top, and the chromosomes, actually 4 of them are kind of merged together real close, they're kind of tied together, and in that when they're in that form, there's actually gene transfers that happen between the chromosomes. Little pieces of one gene will switch places with another gene on a different chromosome. Does that make sense? It does. That's what happens. And that's a very simplistic view of it. And this is really cool because this is where a lot of our variation comes in species that reproduce sexually, because you don't get exact copies of the parent. This is one of the stages where variation occurs in this process. Then these, what are called tetrads, instead of 2, you have 4, they divide as a mitosis. They just divide into 2 cells, and now you're back to 46 chromosomes for the human. However, there's one more step, and this is where interesting. You have one more division that happens in the sex cells in meiosis, where the 46 chromosomes now split apart into 23 in 4 different cells. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4. So for every parent, you get 4 sperm cells and 4 egg cells. Does that make sense? It's very complicated. This is a simple view of it. And there's all kinds of chemistry and enzymes and hormones that are involved in this. But what I wanted to show you is that these 2 processes are really different. Now you got to remember, evolution says that the left-hand side over a slow time period, over a long period of time, transferred or changed into the sexual process. They're totally different processes. Back? Okay. The cool thing about it, I think about this, is that last step is that's where you get a lot of variation, because now these sex cells have half the genetic characteristics of the original parent, and then those will commingle with the other sex, the eggs or the sperm, and you'll have a ton of variation that'll happen. So some of the critical questions, and these are in no particular order or importance, just some questions to ask about this difference. Genetic instructions for sexual meiosis would interfere with mitosis, terminating reproduction, probably both of them. You can't mix a partial sexual step in the asexual process without it detrimentally affecting that process. Does that make sense? It seems to me that would be kind of a critical thinking concept. Half sexual, half asexual, meantime, no reproduction would result. It has to be, again, fully functional, doesn't it? Sexual meiosis would have to concurrently develop both in the male and female of the organism at the same time. That's a big ask to do. Timing is everything in this. Without sexual meiosis, how would you get male and female in the first place? Because cloning, you don't get differences in sexes. You don't get different sexes. You get whatever you started with. Sexual reproduction is where sex happens, and it is determined. Can asexual meiosis account for new reproductive organs and biochemicals and required for sexually reproductive organisms, since they are not present in the asexual organism itself? You have to have a lot of things from the outside driving those two different processes, and they're completely different. And they're actually a result of those processes. It's, again, the circular problem. Correct reproductive DNA code, enzymes, and hormones and biochemicals, all at the same time. Sex cells exactly 50% of the parent cell. Why not 45%? Why not 70%? You'd have some pretty weird looking creatures, wouldn't you? It's precise. That happened all by accident over a long period of time, right? Complete transition from asexual to sexual in the first generation? If not, guess what? Another dead end. Well, here's a very simple process. Somebody mentioned this earlier. Male and female, who's first? Which one evolved first? For the mayfly, the male mayfly showed up, and the female didn't show up until 15 minutes later. There's a problem. I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but it's kind of the concept. You have to have both in place at the same time, don't you? I once saw a cartoon about the origin of life where Garfield the cat crawled out on an ocean beach, and he had two saber-tooth teeth. And it said, and fortunately for him, 15 minutes later, the first mouse appeared, and there was a little saber-toothed mouse that came out. And I got to thinking about it. I says, that's really not the critical question. Where's Mrs. Garfield? Yeah? It has to be at the same time, fully functional. Male and female simultaneously in the first generation, if not, guess what? that organism is toast. Male and female physical design. I'm not all here. Houston, we have a problem. What if you're half male or half female or both? How does fertilization happen? How does gestation happen? How does birth or egg hatching or seed formation or germination happen if you have just half of the physical structure of a male or half of a female? Does that make sense? Those all have to be done in the first generation. The koi fish gets 225 years to get her done. 100% male and female simultaneously in the first generation. If not, guess what? A dead end. This is the most risque picture I have in here. This shows a diagram of a male and female organism. So if it offends you, close your eyes, okay? It's actually a diagram of a flower. I love flowers. I raise a lot of them. And it shows the male and female structural parts of the flower. Up in the upper corner is a lily. The female organ is that central stem or yellow structure there. It has different parts to it, okay? The male part, called a stamen, are those little small side branches with a little knob on the end, and that's where the pollen resides. The pollen then, in the reproductive fertilization process, is transferred to the top of what's called the stigma, which is the top of the yellow structure. And it then forms a tube that goes down inside there, down to the ovary, which is the center of the yellow, and that's where fertilization occurs, because that's where the ovum is, or the egg, the flower egg is, and that's where the seed forms. Okay, does that make sense? It's a very simple structure, but it's very complicated. What happens if you don't have the male part? Are you going to get reproduction happening? No. What if you have the male part, but there's no pollen? It hasn't formed yet. It hasn't evolved yet. And it's interesting, I was thinking for the flowers, there might be a third party involved. What if bees hadn't evolved at this point? Then the pollen's not going to get transferred, right? Even though they're both there. So it's actually a worse problem. Now you got a third party involved in this reproductive. You know, what is that? Isn't there saying about love when there's, two, it's okay, three is not, that's not a good little combination? Well, in terms of a flower, it's critical. So here's an example of looking at how the male and female parts have to be fully functional at the same time in a compatible mechanism or structure. And it has to be done in the what generation? First generation. Male and female physical design. There's thousands of organisms in this world, each with unique morphology, that's form. Male and female forms compatibly match together, like the flower. Do you know what this is? This is a female ovary of a pine tree. Did you know that? You didn't know that, did you? If you look on the right-hand side of that picture, you'll see a different kind of pine tree. The large cone that looks like this is the female ovary, and the ovums are on the inside of those, underneath those little hard things. Okay? Those little petals, if you will. The males are also on the same tree. They're usually different structure, different size, usually smaller. And the pollen blows around in the wind and attaches itself or commingles with the ovum in this structure right here. Isn't that interesting? What happens if you have a pine tree and all of the male pine cones fall off prematurely? You're going to lose that generation of seeds, aren't you? Or if this is not fully functional. You have to have both both the male and female there, but the morphology, the forms of it have to be proper in the proper relation with each other in order for it to happen. It all has to be present in the first generation. Matched compatibility of male morphology simultaneously in the first generation. Again, if it doesn't happen, Houston, we have a serious problem. Specialized organs for facilitating reproduction. There are, depending on the organ, there's thousands of organisms and there are thousands of different structures. I chose one I know a lot about or are familiar with, that we all are, is in this picture. Does anybody know what a pituitary gland is? You've heard of that? It's located right in the base of your brain. That little guy is found in all vertebrates. And it releases hormones controlling sperm formation and the timing of egg meiosis in the ovary. Did you know that? That's interesting. Without that pituitary gland, sexual reproduction would be nada, zero. It wouldn't happen. And it's interesting, the other interesting fact, that particular pituitary gland also generates numerous other hormones that are used in other functions in the body that are not related to reproduction. So think about that. The pituitary gland had to be there in the first generation in order for sexual reproduction to happen. Is it getting better or worse, this picture? The complications. Prostate gland. How many of you in here have prostate glands? Come on. All male mammals have prostate glands, even whales. It's located typically at the base of the bladder, and depending on the organism, it's in different locations, but it's about the size of walnut in humans. The reason why I know about it is that, well, you've heard of prostate cancer and things like that. Some of us had biopsies, some of us had surgeries to get that little guy taken care of. But its function is to produce a fluid protecting the sperm from when it enters the female reproductive tract. Otherwise, the sperms are destroyed by the protective features of the female. If it wasn't for the prostate gland, nobody would be in this room right now. And guess when it has to be fully functioning in order for reproduction in humans to happen? The first generation, doesn't it? Or we're toast. Did something go weird here? Oh. So some critical questions you might want to ask. This is just a little summary. Pituitary glands, prostate glands, ovaries, numerous other organs and structures, all critical to successful reproduction. Some, like the pituitary gland, also support other non-reproductive body functions. The thousands of different organisms have varied organs and structures matched to their unique reproductive system. A mayfly's is different than a human. Questions. How do all the required organs form at the same time? Now we're not only talking about male, female, or DNA, or what we talked about before, half female, half male. We're talking about the actual different unique organs that are involved in any kind of reproductive structure. How did the multi-purpose pituitary gland form just the right hormones for reproduction? How could thousands of different reproductive organs and structures form compatibly matched with thousands of different organisms? What mechanism drove DNA coding for these various organs? Remember, at all at the same time. Here's a new one. How could the placenta organ that nourishes the fetus, develop slowly from a non-placental common ancestor? That's really tough on the first generation if it's not fully there, right? Required organs forming simultaneously in the first generation. If not, no second generation. Here's an interesting one. You know what a PIN number is, don't you? How many of you use PIN numbers? Everybody uses PIN numbers or passwords. Species to species reproductive roadblocks. Fertilization PIN numbers. Did you know that sex cells and sexual reproducing animals have PIN numbers? The egg and sperm of the same species have species-specific chemical codes and corresponding receptors preventing cross-fertilization from other species. The male has a particular chemical PIN number, if you will, and it matches the corresponding female PIN number. And if that specific sperm gets next to that specific egg, they'll commingle together and fertilization will happen. But if you mix a sperm and an egg of two different species, they'll contact each other, but they won't fertilize each other because the PIN numbers don't match. That's pretty fortunate. You know, it's especially fortunate for fish. The ocean is a place where you have hundreds and hundreds of different sperm floating around in the ocean, fertilizing hundreds and hundreds of different species of eggs at the same time, because it's all free floating, for example. Okay? That would be a terrible problem if any time a sperm of anything contacted any other egg. Without a PIN number, that would be a problem. Fortunately, it doesn't work that way. There's specific PIN numbers. How did the PIN numbers form? Gradually. Think about that. Gradually form. A perfect matching code formed concurrently in the male and the female. Just happened to be compatible with each other. Transitioning species would require simultaneous PIN number changes. Think about that. If a species is going from one to another, the PIN numbers have to change concurrently with that. That's a lot to ask. The DNA for one PIN code cannot pass on a new set. It's self-limiting in a real way. PIN number systems prevent spawning new life on purpose, it appears. Unique matching PIN numbers in the first generation? If not, Houston, we have a problem again. Transition points on the evolutionary tree. You know, we all have, you know about the evolutionary tree where you go from one species to another. They think amphibians turned into reptiles. Amphibians reproduce generally by external fertilization, kind of like a fish. Reptiles reproduce by internal fertilization with an amniotic egg. So you're going to have to ask a non-amniotic external fertilization process to change into an internal one if you go from amphibians to reptiles. In order for that to function, it has to perhaps be in the first generation. How could the first reptilian amniotic egg develop from a non-amniotic amphibian egg? Through small successive changes. How many successive permutations would it take to develop physical structures to facilitate internal fertilization in reptiles compared to simple egg and sperm discharge from amphibians? A whole different physical structure of the male and female in order to accommodate that. How could fully functional male and female reptiles develop simultaneously? Back to the old question. How could the reptile egg shell develop from a soft amphibian, soft, moist egg membrane? It's a membrane versus an egg shell. If it doesn't happen in the first generation, we got a problem. I like this one. This is my favorite part. Male and female reproductive rituals. You guys have seen birds dancing in front of each other, right? Every organism has some type of ritual. Reproductive instincts and drives are required in both male and female at the same time. Otherwise, guess what's going to happen? No mating, no reproduction, no second generation. Thousands of organisms, each with unique methods and dances. I call them dances, tied to meiotic maturity of the sperm and egg on top of all of that. I think it's interesting when you think about the salmon coming up and spawning. What happens if the female salmon kind of goes up the river and says, you know, it's time to spawn, but the male decides it's time to go chase herring? That's a little bit of a problem, isn't it? I'm usually driven by my stomach a lot, right? And I don't think it's any different with salmon. 100% match mating drives in the first generation. Are you hearing a theme here? This is cool. You will not believe this. There are bizarre rituals. Probably the most bizarre I've found is the deep sea anglerfish. The male attaches or bites permanently to the female, anywhere on the body. And the male's circulatory system commingles as a parasite with the female and is permanently attached for the life of the male and the female. There is the male attached to that female. It's convenient for the female because she's got a permanent source of sperm for new generations, doesn't she? Well, what a bizarre method, okay? That is different, isn't it? I think it's really cool. How did this system evolve in the first generation? First, they had to find each other down in the bottom of the ocean. And then they had to have this, parasitic relationship happen. And it all had to be done in the first generation because you don't get a lot of time to deal with that, especially when you're in the bottom of the ocean in the dark. Evolutionary answers. Okay, we've talked about some of the ugly facts. Now, how does the evolutionary world answer those questions? Here is a list of the theories that are out there from the evolutionary point of view. Are you ready? There's a lot of them. That's exactly how many there are. Go find a theory that is accepted in the evolutionary world. There is no papers on that. Zippo. Do you know why? Because they don't know why. Sexual reproduction has been called the queen of evolutionary problems, and there's a reason. Richard Dawkins says in The Selfish Gene, the other assumption I have glossed over, that of the existence of sexual reproduction and crossing over, meiosis, is more difficult to justify. This is an extremely difficult question for evolutionists to answer, and frankly, I'm going to evade it. Isn't that an interesting answer? Well, that's Dawkins. He also said in The Blind Watchmaker, for reasons that I haven't the space to go into, the existence of sexual reproduction poses a big theoretical problem puzzle for Darwinians. Yeah, there it is. Graham Bale, a Canadian evolutionist professor, said, sex is the queen of the problems in evolutionary biology. Perhaps no other natural phenomenon has aroused so much interest. Certainly none has showed so much confusion. The insights of Darwin and Mendel, which have illuminated so many mysteries, have so far failed to shed more than a dim and wavering light on the central mystery of sexuality. Houston, we have a problem here. What conclusion can we make? Well, sexual reproduction is like a flying horse. It's evolution's decisive downfall. Sexual reproduction is not evolution's holy grail, but its holy fail. Our logical conclusion as Christians, your Christian faith, it is rational and reasonable to believe that God, not unknown events, created sexual reproduction fully functional to facilitate the first generation of all life and subsequent generations. It's reasonable when we look at the science and the facts and apply critical thinking to what's going on here. It becomes reasonable. with the ugly facts of the evolutionary theory concepts tied to those facts, it kind of is impossible, like a flying horse. In my mind, it is. Sexual reproductive, God's decisive plan all along. That's what we believed, isn't it? Where did Mr. and Mrs. Sockeye Salmon come from and develop the ability to sexually reproduce from the get-go? You ever think about that? What does the Bible have to say about that? Did you know sexual reproduction is God's very first command he gave us in the Bible? Isn't that interesting? So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, what? Be fruitful and multiply. That's called sexual reproduction. And fill the earth and subdue it. Now, thinking about that, obviously if he commanded to do it, that must have meant that he had something in mind when he created us to make us capable of doing that. God made Adam and Eve fit for each other. Then the Lord said, it is not good that man should be alone. Isn't that true? That's what he said right away. Remember, he brought Adam to the animals to Adam to name them, and he did not find a what? A fit mate for him. Genesis 2:18. Fit for Adam? What does that mean? Well, a relational partner, spiritual, emotionally, mentally, to understand, honor, and cherish and value God and each other, right? And a physical compatibility to reproduce, the ability to be fruitful and multiply. That's what God did. And how many generations did he have to do this in? The first generation with the first two people. And all the other animals, perhaps. The context for God, providing a fit partner. God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to man, but for man there was not found a single helper fit for him. Not fit for Adam? What does that mean? Have you ever thought about that? How about Mrs. Chimp? Was she compatible? How about Mrs. Sockeye? No. How about Mrs. Cobra? No. Certainly not Mrs. Anglerfish, right? All the wrong reproductive requirements, chromosomes, organs, pin numbers, specialized organs, and obviously the relational and spiritual. God designed suitable fit mates for all creatures according to their kinds. This is God's plan for us, not Mrs. Deep Sea Anglerfish. I'm really glad about that. So, we're at the end here. What is the takeaways that we need to, I want you to walk out with? There's a lot of stuff in there, and there's many more items and issues that we didn't even cover. And again, it's a very simplistic. And if you were a geneticist and a biologist, you would get, Chris knows probably 10 times more than I've talked about here, and it's very complex. The takeaway is, as Huxley said, the slaying of beautiful hypothesis like evolution by an ugly fact. And the ugly facts are, 1, sexual reproduction is a one-generational issue. That's what I want you to remember tonight. And 2, evolutionary time is not a factor. It doesn't matter. For the mayfly, it takes 5 minutes. Okay? You need 5 minutes to get it done there. I would recommend this book for you all. This is a wonderful book that kind of capsulized the ideas I had in my mind in an organized fashion. And it was fun and witty and had solid critical thinking in it. Darwin's Secret Sex Problem by F. LaGard Smith. Wonderful book. I would highly recommend you do that. It's a fairly expensive book. You know, paperback was $20. Go on Amazon and get it. Darwin's Sex Secret. Secret Sex Problem, excuse me. Highly recommend this book. You got your picture, huh? Our task, like Chris said earlier, is to be prepared to make a solid defense to those who challenge our faith. Reproduction is a marvelous tool because it gets to the very core of the evolutionary equation that we were talking about. And it's so vital and to all of our existence. But we need to do it with gentleness and reverence and think about critical thinking. And here's some critical questions you might want to ask, just generally speaking. This is from Mike Riddle. He's a really good friend of ours, and he came up with these, and I just love them. When you're talking about an evolutionary concept like sexual reproduction, how do you know it's true? You know, the evolutionary theory concepts. Has it ever been observed? What do the facts say? Are you making any assumptions? Those are some of the questions that we could ask. This is good for kids to help them understand this. How do I prepare? Doing what you're doing tonight is one good way. Reading good science books about creation science and magazines and articles. Science DVDs. There's a book table back there with a number of items that Chris has brought. Going to conferences, science meetings, field trips, museums. Go to the Mount St. Helens Creation Museum and learn about geology. And you can subscribe to various organizations, like my favorite is Acts and Facts from ICR. Free, you can get a hold of them, they'll send it to you free. Wonderful articles in there, similar topics. And we have meetings like this one, and also the Snohomish County Apologetics Forum meets regularly, and we have meetings in different cities in the Northwest. And I'd encourage you to start your own library, of course. And visit the Mount St. Helens Creation Center. That's a wonderful place. We offer field trips during the summer. I lead the ones to Dry Falls on a regular basis. I'm going to be announcing some dates coming up. And I'd encourage you again to go to Mount St. Helens, because geology, of course, is a fundamental issue that is used as a foundation for the evolutionary concept. A couple favorite verses of mine relating to our talk tonight, and generally speaking about creation apologetics. Psalms 118:8, it is better to take refuge in the Lord than put confidence in man. Especially when it comes to critical thinking. Because you remember, critical thinking and logic should end with an answer to the question, do horses fly? But you can change that by your agenda, by your need, by your hope. And that's why we need to go to the Lord for this. And one of my favorite verses, Psalm 111:2. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all those who have pleasure in them. He created his creation for us to learn about who he is. And sexual reproduction, in my opinion, is one of the neatest things that God has given our world as a lesson to show who he is and how great he is. Lord, thank you that you made us fit for just the mates that you have for us. Thank you that you had that in mind when you made Adam and Eve, and you made all the different animals and plants in your creation. You made them fit for each other. And it just shows your goodness and your quality and your character. And we just want to honor you for that you have the wherewithal to do it, and the mind and the ability to do it, and you did it, just like we see out there. Thank you in your name. Amen.